Hi, today I'll tell you about some rules by which multidimensional probabilistic information can be learned, and also recent evidence from midbrain dopamine neurons revealing neural encoding of such multidimensional probabilistic reward expectations. Finally, I'll show you how such rich probabilistic information might be useful for generating adaptive, risk-sensitive behavior. So when animals interact with complex and dynamic environments, they're faced with a dual challenge of efficiently representing the environment and leveraging this information to generate adaptable behavior. There are many ways of solving RL problems, as we've seen during this week. In the brain, the cortical basal ganglia circuits are a biological substrate for learning behavior policies or programs from rewards in environments. So the idea is striatum receives both information from cortex about the state of the world and available actions, and reward prediction errors conveyed by midbrain dopamine neurons in order to update the value of combinations of states and actions to produce behavioral policies. So classic RL algorithms estimate a single scalar value. However, recently, more data suggests that a bank of values and not a single value is being learned. Consistent with distributional RL algorithms, dopamine neurons have been found to reflect diversity in the learning weights for positive and negative reward prediction errors. So to generate a set of values instead of a single value. So for example, let's consider this neuron here represented as a red dot. This neuron updates more has a higher learning weight for positive compared to negative reward prediction errors, and therefore will converge to an estimated value that is positively biased, or what we call optimistic. On the other hand, this neuron here, represented as a blue dot, has a higher learning weight for negative than for positive reward prediction errors, and therefore converges to this negatively estimate of future rewards. In principle, having access to this bank of values allows for flexible behavior. For example, if we consider a hungry mouse, then instead of using the expected value to guide future decisions, then it might instead use the minimum of rewards in order to make sure he gets a sufficient amount of food to survive. However, the environment can be also dynamic. If it's foraging and if it sees that the sun is rising and therefore the window for foraging is closing, then it might seek short latency rewards. So these are just two examples highlighting how either the internal dynamics or the environment dynamics might incentivize the use of knowledge regarding multiple features of rewards in the environment. So let's start with the theory. How might we efficiently learn a joint distribution of rewards? So previous work has shown that distributional RL algorithms converge to the efficient code proposed originally by Barlow that has been widely studied in the fields of sensory neuroscience. Efficient coding predicts that if there's a finite set of neurons here represented by these colored dots, then they should be allocated proportionally to the probability distribution of the stimulus they are encoding. In practice, they should be uniformly distributed in a cumulative probability space. Additionally, multidimensional efficient codes have been proposed. However, learning rules for these multidimensional codes are lacking. It's not trivial to generalize these one-dimensional learning rules to higher dimensions. And this is because in one dimension, there is one and only one way of dividing the probability mass function into equal mass parts that are the quantons. However, in higher dimensions, there are many ways of doing this. We can, for example, rotate the partition here represented in black, or consider other partitions. A principled way of solving this degeneracy problem is to In addition to optimize how well a set of units or neurons encodes the distribution of a stimuli, also optimize the efficiency of the learning trajectory. So if you consider a set of, an initial set of units, here represented in purple, so each unit has a preferred stimuli. We can use samples from this range distribution, here represented in blue, and that converges to a good representation of the joint distribution over S1 and S2. Sorry. So in this case, the learning trajectory here represented in gray is kind of twisted. It doesn't correspond to the optimal learning trajectories. The optimal learning trajectory is a line. So the line is the fastest way of going from one point to the other in space. Additionally, our learning rules preserve the population geometry. I'm going to show you an example and give you intuition for the one-dimensional case. So consider here on the bottom, there's an initial set of units or neurons. We can give samples from this distribution here represented in blue until the units converge to the target distribution. And we see that the tuning of the neurons, they're preserved from the initial to the target distribution. In other words, the tuning of the neurons, they don't cross. So the neuron here tuned to the smaller stimuli will be transported to the smaller stimuli in the target distribution. This is really important for decoding information from this population of neurons, because if the context switch, if the distribution changes, then the decoder doesn't need to relearn the tuning of the population. So in practice, to learn these multidimensional distributions, we have samples represented here by S. We have a set of units or neurons represented by theta. We want to approximate the samples in a smooth way. The first term we optimize is the KL, which approximates the units towards the samples. And the second is the Wasserstein between the units at different iterations, which regularizes the learning trajectories such that are smooth and direct. I won't go through details, but our learning rules are a combination of two forces. One that attracts the units towards the samples, here represented in blue, and the other one that regularizes the unit interactions and make sure that the units don't collapse into a single point. There recently been proposed multivariate distributional learning rules in the machine learning field, where instead of optimizing the KL, another distributional metric is used, the maximum mean discrepancy, but it's not considered this regularizer over the learning trajectories. So I've shown you how we can learn efficiently multidimensional distributions of features of the environments, and how these learning rules preserve the population geometry, which allows for an efficient decoding method. Now I'll show you recent evidence that dopamine neurons are encoding a multidimensional distribution of future rewards in time and magnitude. So the idea is that midbrain dopamine neurons are not only tuned to different reward magnitudes, but they're also tuned to different reward times. So some neurons are expecting rewards after short delays, and others are expecting rewards after longer delays. In terms of implementation, this might be implemented by a diverse set of temporal discount functions. So in order to test for signatures of joint time magnitude distributional reinforcement learning in the brain, in previous work, we did a set of electrophysiological recordings from optogenetically identified dopamine neurons in mice during behavior. The task was a simple classical conditioning where different orders predicted rewards. One cue predicted after a fixed delay of 3 seconds a certain reward magnitudes. So here I'm showing you the decoded joint distribution of reward times and magnitudes from the population activity at the cue onset, so before the reward comes. So this axis here corresponds to the reward magnitude, how big is the reward. And this axis here is the time delay it takes for the reward to arrive. We can compare the decoded map of rewards with the one decoded from the population activity for a queue that predicts, instead of a certain reward magnitude, a variable one, sampled from this slightly bimodal distribution, so the endpoints of a slightly bigger probability mass function. We see that in this case, if you look here at the magnitude axis, indeed, these maps can capture the variability in magnitude. Additionally, we can look at the other three queues in our task that predict a certain reward magnitude, but at different times. So if you look here at the time axis, you can see that indeed these maps, they capture this different timing of when the reward is coming in the future. So this is evidence that dopamine neurons contain information about the distribution of rewards over magnitudes and time. However, we also wanted to understand if these neurons are adapting efficiently to the distribution of rewards in the environment. So to test this hypothesis, also in previous work, we manipulated the rewards times in the experiment. So we added removes towards the end of the recording session, the shortest or the longest delay. If we go back to our predictions, so initially we consider this uniformly distributed set of neurons, units. We give samples from a distribution that is biased to longer reward times. And the prediction is that the neurons should shift their tuning functions to better encode the longer reward times. And on the other hand, because the population activity, the population geometry is reserved, then the tuning of the neurons should be, on average, correlated between the different contexts, different distributions. On the other hand, when we take out the longest delay and give samples of rewards at short latencies, then the prediction is that the tuning of these neurons should now shift towards shorter reward times. And on the other hand, similarly, because there are no crossovers of the tuning functions, then these tuning functions should be correlated for the two different contexts. So now I'm going to show you how we estimated this change in the tuning functions of dopamine neurons. So basically, I'm going to show you. So here I'm showing you the tuning of these neurons before and after we took out either the shortest or the longest delay. So each dot here is a single neuron. And we can see that indeed it seems that when taking the longest delay, the tuning of the neurons shift to shorter times compared to when taking the shortest one. On the other hand, we can see that it seems that on average the tuning of these neurons is preserved for the different context switches. So I've shown you how dopamine neurons contain information about this risk with this very rich probabilistic map of future rewards in environments. But how can we use this representation for decision making? So first I'll tell you how we can use it for single decisions and then for sequential decisions. The idea for single decisions is we can apply these linear weights to the time magnitude maps in order to generate rich sensitive behaviors. So in behavioral economics, neuroeconomics, and even in psychology, researchers study how humans make risk-sensitive decisions over both reward times and magnitudes. In this field, the subjective preferences are measured by curves as the one that I'm showing you here. So this plot represents the subjective value as a function of the delay for two monetary values. So the full line corresponds to the discounting of subjective value with delay for $500, and the dashed line for bigger rewards of $10,000. So each dot in this curve was estimated by asking human participants if they preferred an immediate or delayed reward magnitude. And then the point here was the immediate reward magnitudes for which participants preferred equally the immediate and the delayed option. And there's this really interesting reverse effect where, if you think about it, where the discounting of rewards with delays is bigger for smaller reward magnitudes, but the reverse happened in terms of reward uncertainty. So people discount less smaller reward magnitudes in terms of uncertainty. And researchers have asked if this is a behavior signature that these risk sensitive behaviors are being generated by different neural circuits. And we have this opportunity of taking the reward time magnitudes distributions that we decode from midbrain dopamine neurons and asking, can we model these risk biases considering independent weights for times or magnitudes? Or do we need weights that are multidimensional and that aren't independent? So we can't get this reverse in the curves for delays and certain rewards if we consider that the weights are independent. On the other hand, if you consider that the weights are multidimensional, in particular if you consider that there's the discrete in the discounting of the delay to rewards that decreases for smaller reward magnitudes, then we see that in this case, we are able to generate this flip in the order of the curves. As future work, we want to also model reaction times and generalize drift diffusion models of decision making using these distributional predictive maps. So now I'm going to finally show you how we can actually use these maps for sequential decision making. I'm going to show you, this is a very simple example where each queue predicts a different patch or locations rewards sampled from different joint distributions over time and magnitudes. So for example, Q1 predicts after a long delay, a big reward magnitude. On the other hand, for example, Q2 predicts after a short delay, a variable small reward magnitudes. And the idea is that if an agent has access to this map, then it can actually compute the expected rewards over time. So for example, if he senses Q1, and he knows that there'll be rewards later in patch 1. However, if immediately after he senses Q2, then he knows that before going to patch 1, he should go to patch 2. However, a standard RL agent has to represent as states the time since all the queues. So it requires much more samples from the environment than the TMRL agent. In fact, the state space increases exponentially with the time between the queues and with the number of queues. So indeed, if we simulate an agent that has access to these time magnitude maps and the standard RL agent is only estimating a single scalar value, then we see that indeed the TMRL agent is able to learn faster and is also able to generalize across a bigger number of cues or stimuli. So in summary, I've shown you how we can efficiently represent multidimensional features of the environment. I've also shown you neural signatures in dopamine neurons, where these neurons are in fact encoding these multidimensional distributions of rewards in times and magnitudes. And lastly, I've shown you how these representations can be used for single decisions by applying linear weights that produce very rich risk-sensitive behavior. And finally, how they can be combined in order to solve sequential decision-making tasks. So I'd like to thank everyone that contributed to this work. So William Walker, Joe Patton, and Daniel McNamee. And thank you for being here until the end.